Again, welcome. Thank you for joining. We have a lot of really useful information for better understanding Vicarius. Hey there. Yeah, say hello in the chat, everyone. Thank you. We're going to be covering vRx in detail. We're going to be going through a lot of different really exciting use cases and showing you all a tour of the product and making sure that you are much more familiar with it. Yeah, I'd love to see that in the chat there. So a little bit about what we're going to be covering today, the intro, the objectives, the focus of today's session, the goals. We want everyone to become more familiar with the product, know the ins and outs of it, know the common use cases, know how to, and we'll see here in just a second with the focus section, this is specifically for our partners. So we want to help you guys with making sure that your customers are taken care of with Vicarius and making sure that they're able to get the most out of the product, and you guys are really all experts in it. So with that, we're going to be covering mostly technical points today, but we are going to be kind of having that pre-sale sales lens on it as well, just evaluating the competitive landscape, looking at some of the sectors that we're very strong in, the use cases, and just keeping some of those things in mind. Little bit of housekeeping on that as well. We are going to be doing a more advanced technical session, probably towards the end of the quarter in late March. So if anyone is looking to, get more hands-on and really take some of the topics that we're going to be covering today and just go much more deep into those, getting your hands on some virtual machines, actually putting this to practice, definitely suggest checking out that one and joining us for that session in a couple months. In terms of questions, again, yeah, please use the chat. We've got some people helping out here today who I'll be introducing in just a moment. Yeah, we would love to see any questions that you might have so we can make sure it's a very focused session. And yeah, aside from that, why are we all here today? We want to get our partners certified in Vicarius. We want to make sure that you guys are all subject matter experts in the product. You know it inside and out. You know the use cases, the strengths, the weaknesses. And our partners who maintain that certification do get some benefits out of that. You get priority for receiving leads that we're working on. We are a channel first company, so if we get something from our outbound activities, we are going to assign that to a partner, and maintaining a certification within your technical staff and sales staff for that matter is going to give you guys priority for that. And of course, it's great to share that on LinkedIn and so on. And you got a little screenshot on the left-hand side of what that certification is going to look like. So that is something that everyone is going to get for following along today. A little bit about the agenda. So we're going to cover the challenge of vulnerability management. What are we looking to solve with the product? And not only that, how has the landscape shifted? What are some of the trends that we're seeing in the landscape today over the last year or so? We're going to go over our platform, of course. We're going to review why customers choose us, some of the competitive landscape, the technology. We're going to be going and doing a lab. It's going to be a demo that's going to be led by me again. If you want to get more hands-on, we're going to be doing that session in late March. So keep an eye out for that one. And then we've also got some exciting session with Jordan, who's going to be guest starring today later on, and he's going to be showing some of the latest things with the professional services vAnalyzer, how we can use that to gain some insights and kind of go through some of the data that we're pulling from the tool. And then finally, we'll wrap things up with some next steps. We'll be sending out the recording, the deck, some additional materials. So we will cover that in due time. Presenters, I think probably most people here know myself and know Jordan, but we're going to be leading the session today. Like I said, Jordan's going to be joining a little bit later on for a section on our new professional services offering, kind of the Vicarius skunk works almost, working on some cool and exciting projects there that are really helping to adapt the product to some difficult use cases for really complex workloads and things like that. So definitely stay tuned for that towards the end. I'm Ryan. I've been with the team for close to 3 years now, and leading the solution architect team here in North America. So again, probably most of the people here I'm pretty sure I've worked with, and it's great to see you all. And we've got some moderators who I've convinced to join us today. They've graciously accepted, so they're going to be helping out in the chat a little bit while I'm doing the demo over here. So do feel free to ask some questions. We've got Hen, who I think again everyone probably knows. We've got Zach, who is a relatively recent addition to the team, helping out with customer success, helping Hen, stepping into the customer success engineer as Jordan moves into our professional services engineering role. And one of the most recent additions, we've got Griffin, who's going to be helping out with the solution architect on the West Coast as we kind of ramp up the sales team here. So with that, yeah, let's jump right into it. What are the challenges that we're solving? Just a quick overview. The landscape of vulnerability management, it's just as complex as ever. There's more vulnerabilities. Patch cycles take a long time to apply, and a lot of attacks are actually the results of a vulnerability being exploited. So just from a very, very high level, we can see, some of those stats. And yeah, it's clearly something that is continuing to grow, as I'll actually show in the next slide here. So the threat continues to grow. In 2024, we saw just over 40,000 vulnerabilities. And in 2025, it's projected to be over 45,000. This is a projection that first.org does every year. They're generally within 1% or 2. It's actually interesting. NVD has had a bit of a slowdown, let's say. So actually, the real number is probably a bit higher than this because this is based on NVD. But the main takeaway from this is that whatever the cost and both dollar and time that we're spending in previous years, this is continuing to grow in order to protect our environments and make sure that vulnerabilities are being tracked and effectively mitigated. So that's something that we see continuing to grow, and we can see kind of the bands here. Looks like it's at the high end, just over 55,000. At the low end, 45,000. So actually, that 45,000 is a fairly conservative number. And with the sort of life cycle of a vulnerability, we have those 3 different sections. We have the identifying vulnerabilities, we have assessing or prioritizing them, and we have remediating them. So another challenge, is not just the sheer number, but a lot of teams are kind of faltering and struggling with the actual remediation of the vulnerabilities. There was a recent survey that showed 61% of organizations felt that their identification was effective, but only 9% felt that their remediation was effective. There's a couple of reasons for that. Remediation is you're actually making a change. You're not just looking for something. You could be disrupting, you could be stopping some critical services that cause downtime, and there's a lot of complexity involved in that. But not only that, the shortcomings from the previous stages start to compound. So any vulnerabilities you miss in the identification process will compound into the assessment phase. Your remediation is only as good as your assessment. So any shortcomings there, any additional time spent there is really going to start to show itself in the remediation. So it all kind of trickles downstream. And that's part of the reason why we are seeing some of these figures. And another challenge is that a lot of vulnerabilities are not solvable via patch alone. So we have seen that there is an uptick in this. There is fairly limited data, so it's hard to give an exact number. But somewhere roughly in the 15 to 20% of vulnerabilities require a configuration change, either in addition to a patch or as the sole source of mitigation. You think of a registry key change or something that has to change with a protocol, or think about Print Nightmare, where we had to stop that service briefly. Or think about Eternal Blue, where SMB v1 needs to be disabled or upgraded to a newer version. So we are seeing more and more of those, and it's really difficult for a lot of organizations. It actually remains kind of out of reach because many products don't do a great job at this section. And many organizations, that do try to tackle it, take a more manual approach, trying to develop scripts and things like that, and they just simply don't have the resources to dedicate to those types of things. Now, of course, obviously, AI has helped with that, but still testing, something that you generate on ChatGPT to, mitigate a vulnerability. That's going to be something that you might want to be a little bit weary of running in a production environment in, let's say, a large enterprise. So it is something that is, kind of a blind spot and certainly has a bit more complexity than a patch that's released by a trusted vendor. That in most cases, obviously we've all had a bad patch from Microsoft or something like that, but in most cases those patches are going to be much more tested than something like a script. Again, especially if you're just kind of pulling that from either AI or from some other community or something like that. So certainly a lot of challenges around that you don't necessarily see with the patching side of things. Another challenge is that many sectors tend to utilize end of life software. Think about manufacturing is the one that always comes to mind. Sometimes even in healthcare and other ones with very strict, sensitive rules around the data requirements because they are collecting that patient healthcare data. I've even seen in the financial sector, using very old legacy software. I think probably everyone on the call has seen that to some degree. Open source software is another one. Proprietary software is another one. These are often very difficult to, kind of get a hold of and understand how can we keep using those applications, but doing so in a way that, these vulnerabilities might have their threat reduced or have their risk reduced. In 2024 specifically, we saw that there was actually a 10% increase in the weaponization of older vulnerabilities from prior to 2024. So we are seeing that, just because it is an older vulnerability, which might, have a higher chance of affecting an older end of life piece of software, that is something that we do want to make sure that we are applying that protection to of some kind. And again, it's very difficult because a lot of organizations have kind of built that into their production stack. They don't have the option of just simply removing it or putting it into a sandbox or something like that. So we want to try to find a way that's the best of both worlds in order to protect that. And then this is just kind of a visual, just again, pointing back to some of those points that I made on the previous slide there. So just kind of hammering that point home of, patching alone is not the full remediation cycle. There are other things that we need to, consider outside of that. Another thing, and this kind of interestingly, I mentioned that there's 10% of old vulnerabilities that are being weaponized, but something that we're also seeing as a trend is that the initial window of a vulnerability release is often the most chaotic time. The analogy I like to use is when you're at the grocery store and you're in that really long checkout line, and then the cashier next door opens up and everyone kind of bolts over. Threat actors are kind of like that too, where they want to, try to tap into that initial chaos, and they want to, try out the latest exploits and see what they can do with it, what kind of damage. They're very opportunistic people. So we actually were seeing 25% of, this is from 2023, but 25% of vulnerabilities which were exploited in the wild were shown to be exploited within the same day of the vulnerability being published. And then that kind of 3-week window showed the additional 75%. So within about the first 3 weeks is often the riskiest time for some of those known exploited vulnerabilities. So the takeaway that is that speed, making sure that we're patching these very quickly, we're applying remediation, we're closing out that loop is extremely important. So that's a lot about the challenge. It's kind of dizzying when you look at it in some cases. The odds are really stacked against, I think, defenders. But for us, we see that there's a huge opportunity in the market. There's a lot of gaps that people are not covering as well as they would like to. So there's quite a lot of room for improving this area and making sure that vulnerabilities are being remediated. So let's go into why customers choose us, and then we're going to talk about the product a little bit. So probably I think most people on the call have seen this slide or a similar one. And I don't want to take too much time on the sales side of things, but I think the main takeaways on this are that this is a problem that all different organizations are dealing with. It's not specific to any one sector. So manufacturing, public sector, healthcare, finance, legal, large enterprise, small, medium business, it really affects everybody. Anyone who is running a modern company with any sort of IT assets is dealing with this problem to some capacity. The other takeaway of this is given the stage that we are as a company, we're a Series B company, is that we have these logos that are very well recognized. They're enterprise logos. They're in sectors which are very stringent and very difficult to get into, like, again, healthcare, like finance, technology as well, usually cutting edge types of vendors there. So the fact that they're giving us their trust, and we're able to help them mitigate their vulnerabilities, I think says a lot about the company, the vision, and the product. This slide, I call this the battleship. You sunk my battleship slide, but I think it's good to kind of see the matrix here, of mapping back to some of those challenges we talked about, a little bit ago there, and how we've kind of built the product to solve those challenges. And when we look at it like that, we really are the only vendor that puts that all together in a single tool. Some vendors do other things. Obviously, you have your scanners, then you have your patching tools, but to get that into a consolidated package, that's another reason why customers choose us and depend on our technology. So yeah, enough about the kind of sales side of things, and we're going to kind of sprinkle that in here and there with some of the use cases that I'm going to talk about in the labs. But yeah, let's talk about the solution. So again, we talked about the challenge. We talked a little bit about why customers choose us, but how do we put that all together? How does it happen? So vRx, again, it's a consolidated solution. We're trying to build in components that help us to support each cycle of the vulnerability. We want to detect the vulnerability. We want to assess it. So you're not just, in that paralysis by analysis phase, I like to call it, where you're overwhelmed by just this, absurd number of vulnerabilities and all of the challenges we talked about. But we can kind of make actionable insights from that, and make it much more simple to wrap our head around, and make sure that those compounding challenges that I mentioned earlier with the, why we're seeing such a low number on the remediation, making sure that's not such a big issue, and making sure that people are feeling more confident in the remediation. The solution is real time. It's as near real time as it possibly can be, which we know is very important for the just the current landscape. Again, the sheer number of vulnerabilities. Workloads are more distributed than ever before. There's more applications than ever before. The way that we've worked continues to evolve, and we need a solution that we can continue to depend on for those types of environments. And we want to automate it as well. We see that the number of vulnerabilities is only climbing. The trend is continuing to go up and up, and it shows no signs of slowing. So a lot of customers that we're speaking to are saying things like, well, we're thinking about hiring another person or two, to solve this, and that may still be needed. But what we can do by building policies for highly repeatable tasks is we can, kind of offset that a little bit. So doing more with less, essentially, and making sure that those processes are built out in a way that, again, can be highly automated. So again, just kind of talking about those three different stages here. We've got the analyze, the prioritize, and the remediate, and those are kind of the core pillars of vRx. The analysis is, again, it's all done in real time, both looking at the inventory of the environment, as well as what's happening out in the world. Are there new vulnerabilities being published? Keeping track of your assets. This is one that, it always sounds very basic, but from my previous experience in incident response, I found that that's not always the case. It was always surprising how I would hear customers say when we're doing a recovery from ransomware that they weren't sure if we had accounted for all of their assets. They might have an XP machine floating around somewhere, or a Windows 7 machine floating around somewhere that has all these old vulnerabilities on it, and they're just not sure. So being able to track that is really the first step of the battle, and it really, again, kind of feeds into those later stages and makes sure that we can do them effectively. Something that I like to talk about is with your patching. Because there are a lot of patching solutions out there. There's the Windows patching, the WSUS, Windows Automatic Update Service, and those kinds of things. But if you're just blindly applying patches without mapping it to the vulnerabilities, you can't be sure that a specific vulnerability has been mitigated. If you get a questionnaire or a vendor risk survey or a cyber insurance questionnaire that asks you those things, it really isn't enough to satisfy some of those requirements, which we're seeing more and more of, which I think is a good thing that people are recognizing that this is a really big issue. The prioritization, again, we want to make sure that that sheer number of vulnerabilities, it makes sense. We can kind of wrap our heads around it. We can perform actions based on what we're seeing there. So instead of looking at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, we can see that really a lot of that boils down to a couple problematic assets or a couple problematic applications, and this really helps us to map out and make very informed remediation decisions. The remediation is really our biggest focus. So those other two pillars, the first two, the analysis and the prioritization, those feed into the remediation and make that possible in the way that we want to do it. So the coverage of all of the different operating systems that we cover with the tool, the coverage of all of the third-party applications, the scripting, the patchless protection, which is also very unique. Those allow us to make sure all that information we're pulling from the earlier stages is being acted upon in a way that offers us some protection. And a couple of the different, looking at that remediation stage, again, that is our focus. So you'll see that there are a couple different capabilities that, again, allow us to get that coverage that we offer with this. So we do have the patching, and I'm going to show a little bit more on that in a little bit here. We have the scripting engine. So that's more for the configuration-based vulnerabilities. We've got a couple exciting changes coming to that pretty soon. So definitely, if you do plan on joining that training in late March, I hope to be able to share more on that around that time. And then the patchless protection. Again, this is very unique. So this is something that's going to help us to cover, any applications which might not have a patch or might not be able to be patched. The security team, they'd always say, let's just remove it. Let's get rid of it. If we can't patch it, if it's got all these vulnerabilities, let's get rid of it. IT, operations, management, they might not be on the same page. Of course, everyone can see the merit in that, but it's not always so simple. Sometimes, an organization is running a very old application, and there's just nothing you can do to patch it. So the patchless protection is our answer to that. It's the best of both worlds. It's going to help us to reduce the risk, close off some attack vectors, and it's going to allow that application to continue functioning. With the patching, so this is a really large point that we'd like to emphasize when we're doing demos, when we're doing POCs with clients, and something that really shows itself in the POC as well, is just the sheer number of applications and operating systems that we cover. So over 10,000 third-party applications is one of, if not the largest library of any product of this kind, meaning that if you have a more obscure application, if you have something that's not just your standard kind of Chrome, first party Microsoft Office, Acrobat, those types of things, we do have coverage for those as well. So being able to depend on that, not having to do too much extra legwork. I think about building out SCCM packages, going and having to look for those MSIs, those executables for those new versions, and then pushing those out to a collection. A lot of that is handled for you in the product with the just sheer coverage that we have. So that is a really big point that we'd like to emphasize, like I said, in some of those demos and POCs. So this one's a little bit about the architecture of the tool. We are, and I think most people here probably know this, we are an agent-based solution, primarily anyway. So a lot of the functionality comes from that agent. That's really, where a lot of our strengths lie, and a lot of our value prop is around the things that the agent gives us the capability to do. There are some other capabilities, but which we'll touch on. But the agent is going to be, probably about 80-90% of the product, I would say. Or it feeds into 80 or 90%, I should say. So, whenever people hear about an agent, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, we've got all these agents installed already for our EDR, our RMM, so on and so forth. They have that kind of agent fatigue. It's understandable. I totally get that. The agent is very lightweight. Obviously everyone says that. That's another reason why we want to emphasize getting people into a POC, because they can see it for themselves. We do have figures on that in our knowledge base, where we've kind of observed it in different behaviors and taken averages. So that's one thing that we can share, but certainly the POC would be the goal there, so that they can see that firsthand and not just take our word for it. Obviously, what you're doing with the agent matters. So the agent being idle versus performing some actions, that is going to impact some of the resource utilization. So that's something to bear in mind. And we do have some best practices around that. Really, that is specific to the patchless protection. We actually have some new optional features which allow us to limit, how much resource, how many resources, sorry, are being used by the agent with the CPU utilization optional feature. So that's something that we can use to kind of implement a check and balance, basically, if that is still a concern. There are obviously the network side of things, and we see kind of a sample with the architecture here, what that would look like. So we can see, these are the on-prem devices. We've got our desktops, we've got our servers. We also see this proxy here. That is optional. It's not something that's required. We do see that in larger environments being much more adopted than in smaller ones. Also, if we do see it in a smaller environment, it's generally something like finance, where the network rules have to be very strict. They only want to do explicit allows to specific URLs and things like that. So that is a great option. Gives us a lot of flexibility for some cases where that might be necessary. And the endpoints aren't allowed to go out to the internet over 443 to everything, basically. The other benefit to the proxy is the network bandwidth. Downloading patches does take network bandwidth, and we're pulling that from the vendor repository in a lot of cases. So pulling that to each and every machine at maybe the exact same time is a lot of load on the network. Now, you should probably do that during maintenance windows, but let's say for laptops, you want to push those out during the day because that's when the users are online. So having something like the proxy, which is going to give you that local caching capability, is going to, again, give you the best of both worlds, in the sense that you can set up the patch job to run during the day when it's very busy. It's kind of the main production hours. It's going to cache that patch on the local network, meaning that it's going to greatly reduce the bandwidth that's being used on the network, rather than downloading that patch maybe thousands of times from the vendor repositories directly to each and every endpoint. It's going to have that stop over at the proxy, and then the local machines will just get it from there. So it's just pulling from the local network, rather than every single time going out to the vendor. One other point that's really beneficial about the agent, I touched on this earlier, is just, again, the way that we're working today. It's much more distributed. Not only the work from home stuff, the hybrid stuff, but cloud, colo, on-prem. There's all of these different sites, remote locations, satellite offices. There's all of these different things to consider that kind of build up a modern business in a lot of cases, especially in the enterprise. That we, having the agent not relying on some on-prem appliance that's needed in every single case is going to give us that coverage. We're going to be agnostic to the device's location. So regardless of where the device resides, we'll have visibility over it. We'll be able to patch it. We'll be able to protect it. What was the password manager that got breached? It's eluding me at the moment, but really popular one, LastPass. That's it. That was from a remote employee. So lacking that visibility over someone who's remote, maybe they don't have a connection to the on-prem network, and they're outside of that scope of visibility. Making sure that we have those situations covered and we have that that level of protection for remote devices is very important. It's also continuous, so the agent is going to help us to be able to understand what changes are happening in the environment. New applications are being installed, devices are being moved from one location to another. Maybe you move something out into a DMZ. That's going to increase the risk of it. Threat actors might see it. The agent is also auto-updating. So anytime we push out a new patch, that is going to automatically be deployed out into your environment. We do that in a lightweight way. There's a couple different ways that we can control how it's being delivered. We can set up what we call rolling execution. So instead of doing the entire environment all at once, we can break that down into effectively smaller pieces. So that's going to kind of help with that rollout. If you'd like to, we do have the option to disable that auto update. That gives us just a bit more control, or rather you a bit more control over how those updates are delivered. So, you can certainly work with our team and plan out if you do have a customer that kind of meets that criteria where you don't want it just being, upon release, you'd like to schedule some, maintenance window, or you'd schedule some kind of planning for that new deployment. We will release any release notes or change log before that, so you are notified of what exactly is going to be happening. Were there some bug fixes? Are there new features being included in that agent, and when is it being planned to release? And yeah, with that, I think that's probably enough slides for now. So let's jump over to the lab. Cool. So I've got a new dashboard that I've opened up here for this one. I was going to go through that process, but I will briefly touch on some of the different options for opening a dashboard and why you might want to do that. We do have a couple different types of partners here on the call: MSPs, VARs, distributors, and so on. And so you're going to work with your customers in different ways, and I'll try to account for some of those differences here. But just for the sake of having kind of a fresh playground for this demo, I wanted to open up a new dashboard so everyone could see kind of the onboarding process. Before I get into that, I do briefly want to cover, kind of framing this as let's do a POC with a client, because this is pretty much what they would see. So let's talk a little bit about the prerequisites for that and some of the kind of success criteria and things that we see that help quite a bit with that POC process. So this is our POC plan document. I suspect most people have seen this. If you haven't, we'll share this after the call as well with, again, the deck, the recording, certification. But a couple things about our POC. The platform in general, it's very intuitive. We try to pack a lot of capability into a package that is very easy to understand. It's easy to use. So we do see in most cases that the POC is taking this standard 2-week period. Obviously, some environments may need a little bit longer than that, some, a bit less. Everyone's a little bit different. Certainly in those very large, complex enterprise environments, they might want to see a patch cycle or two go through, and that takes some time for those patches to be released. So it makes sense that we would need to see a little bit longer of a POC. But generally, the standard is 2 weeks, which is also the default. But you can certainly speak with your sales rep or myself or Griffin or whoever is working with you to accommodate any additional needs there. As long as we see that they're testing, actively testing the environment, they're not just kind of blowing us off every week and not doing anything with the product. We're pretty flexible with extending that within reason. So definitely do let us know if that's something that you suspect will be needed. In terms of the scope, kind of the rule of thumb, it does vary from org to org, just based on their size, but the kind of yardstick we use is 10 to 20 machines, 10 to 20 assets. I would certainly advise to get as many as possible. I've seen some of the most successful POCs where they've deployed the entire environment. You're probably not going to see that in, again, a large enterprise, but if you're talking a 200, 300, 400 asset deal or smaller, you can definitely push for that. There's no limits on the POC. And what we also find is that does help get us a little bit of kind of stickiness in the environment. Chances are, if they've installed it on 500 machines, they're starting to set up policies, asset groups, integrations even. We can usually be pretty confident that that POC is going to be a success. But again, 10 to 20 is kind of the sweet spot for most organizations. We do recommend that the types of devices that they select in that 10 to 20 are going to be a good sample size of what they would see out in the larger environment. So if they elect to stick to that 10 to 20, and they've got some Server 16, they've got some, CentOS Linux machines, they've got some Mac OS. We'd want to get a few of each of those just so that they can see the behavior once they were to scale that up. But again, 10 to 20 kind of gives us, it's small enough where it feels achievable for them, but it's not too much effort to where it's a really large project and a really large lift. I've also seen on the flip side, I mentioned seeing an entire deployment. By the way, that really helps out our customer success team. They love that because it's really easy to hit the ground running. But I've also seen POCs where they've installed 1 or 2 devices and they're satisfied with what they see there, and that's a success too. So really, again, it's whatever the customer feels comfortable with, but we do recommend that kind of 10 to 20 number as a rule of thumb. We do have a prerequisites document here that just helps to kind of identify some of the things that will be needed in the environment. Really, the main thing is that the network, the devices should be allowed. They have an internet connection. They should be allowed out on 443, which is HTTPS. And that's going to allow the agent to communicate with our backend with their dashboard, get us all the visibility. It's also going to allow the agent to go out to all the vendor repositories. And that's how we get the patches. So it is necessary that it has that communication. As I mentioned earlier, if that's a problem, maybe due to some network rules that are in place, um, we do see in some cases they have a lab environment where they're willing to make that, with the understanding that it's not allowed in the production environment, and they'd probably want to go with the proxy in that case. But I would certainly suggest deploying the proxy, even if they have that lab environment, which is allowed out, just so that we can simulate the real world setting for them and show them that that is something that we're going to be able to achieve. So that would certainly be a consideration. A lot of people ask about EDR. Am I going to have to make any EDR rules to make this work? It depends. It depends on how strict your EDR rules are. In most cases, it's no additional configuration is needed. However, there have been some cases where the agent gets flagged, and in which case we do have a knowledge base article that we can send over, which suggests some rules that can be put in place and basically allow our folder to execute and do what it needs to do. So it's something to be mindful of, but it is typically the exception and not the norm. So I would suspect in maybe 90% of deals that you're not going to have to do anything, which is really great because pretty much everyone has an EDR these days, or next gen AV of some kind. So being able to function with those is going to be very important for a lot of customers. Down at the bottom here, we do have some success criteria for the POC. Obviously, the customer is going to have their own use cases, and that's something that we're going to try to establish very early on. How would they deem this POC as a success? What are they not happy with in their current tool? What are they looking to do better? What are the types of metrics that they're looking to achieve? Is it a patch success rate? Is it a vulnerability average mitigation time that they're looking to achieve? So, kind of asking them and putting the ball in their court and understanding that is going to be, something that we definitely suggest. Some customers don't know, and that's okay. They might be a little bit earlier on in their security journey, and we do, have some best practices and suggestions that we can make for them. And we do also have the suggested success criteria here. These are the parts of the platform that we suggest that they test, so that they can kind of get that full picture. So this is a great way to just kind of keep that tracked throughout the POC process. Another thing too, and then we'll get back over to the dashboard, is in that 2 weeks, generally we will, thanks for that, Nick. Yeah, we have seen that from time to time. So that's a good point. And yeah, definitely something to, like I said, be mindful of. Interestingly, though, we have seen some customers with CrowdStrike where that has not been flagged. So again, it depends on the way that it's configured, and every EDR handles that slightly differently. So, but that is a good point. Thank you. In that 2 weeks, we do typically want to do, that kickoff call where we're setting up the dashboard, we're getting a couple agents installed. That's something that I'm going to pretty much simulate here in a moment. And then we are going to want to do probably a touch point at the halfway point, see how things are going. Do they have any questions? Do they have any issues? What is the feedback? And that just helps us to indicate, kind of the health, how the POC is going. And then if we are sticking to that 2 weeks, we would do another call towards the end of that, just to kind of conclude things and ensure that we did hit all their success criteria. They were able to test everything that they were looking to. If we do need to do an extension, we would cover that typically around that time as well. If there's any metrics that they indicated, there are some reports that we can give them. We've got some custom report options. Jordan's going to cover one of those later. We've got Power BI reports as well. We've got reports in the dashboard. So sometimes the engineering team here will provide those for the customer, especially in the case of these very large deals, so that the people that are testing the tool can go to their management and say, hey, look what I was able to achieve with this in this 2-week period or in this 3-week period. So that they can justify that business value and they can show them, hey, this is what the tool is able to do for us. And that's very important. So yeah, with that, let's kind of go through the process here. When you do open a dashboard, this is the first screen that you're going to see. There's a couple questions that it'll ask you. It just kind of helps us to understand, who we're working with here. If we're doing the POC with the customer, if you're doing the POC with the customer as a partner of ours, this isn't as important because you'll, be there with them. This is more, so kind of if they're requesting the trial on their own, let's say, which is something that we tend to, try to avoid. We want to be with them. We want our partners to be with them. So but it is important. It does help us kind of track things and do some reports and things like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of pick a few things here. One of the first things that we'll see is the deployment. So in order to proceed, we'll need to deploy an agent. We can choose whichever operating system that we want to target. A lot of times when I'm doing a POC, I will just have the person who's joining from the customer side. Usually they're on a Windows station, most cases, sometimes it's a Mac. I'll just have them pull up PowerShell on their machine and run this command. It's the easiest way to get it installed. It doesn't require any, kind of remote connections or anything like that. So it's often the path of least resistance just to kind of get things going and kind of start to familiarize, dip their toes into the product. So I've got an environment here that I'm going to use for this. And I'm going to open up PowerShell. And you can see in the background, we're going to look at some other deployment methods here as well. But in the meantime, let's just go ahead and run that. So this usually takes about a minute or two. This isn't the beefiest AWS machine, so it might be on a little bit on the longer side, but we'll see how long it takes. We should see, assuming that this succeeds, an installation result 0. That tells us that the installation was a success. And then it's going to start doing its discovery, and we'll see that in the dashboard pretty quickly. The PowerShell script, you might have noticed, is doing an invoke web request. So it's basically just copying down the installation files from our repository, which in our case is in S3 with AWS. And that's going to just output that to the device in the home directory, run that, and it's going to specify some of the different configurations that are needed to ensure that it's communicating with the appropriate dashboard. So that's a secret key for the authentication. That's going to be the dashboard name. Nick, you pointed out CrowdStrike there. It's very similar if anyone's done a CrowdStrike deployment or really any other SaaS deployment for that model. So these are just some of the configurations that are going to help that agent, know where to send that information. And we did get that 0, so that is exactly what we're looking for. And what that means is we can click Get Analysis, and we should, I'm going to pause that, don't need to. We'll get some confetti, and we should see our dashboard load in with our asset in just a moment. So this is going to go through what's called a pre-discovery. That process takes anywhere from about 5 to 10 minutes on average. And that's just going to take an inventory of the device. It's going to show us what applications are running on it, what operating system, what version, what build. Then it's going to map that to the vulnerabilities. So based on the versions of the apps that it found, it'll say you have these vulnerabilities. We'll then assess that for risk, which we're going to talk about. And then it's going to show us the patches that are available. So that's all going to happen, like I said, in about that 5 to 10 minute process. Some applications take a little bit longer, so you will sometimes see that number climbing a bit. It's also not uncommon to see that, if we go to this device here, this one did identify it properly, Windows Server 2025, which is what it is. But let's say we're doing workstations and we see we're doing a deployment on Windows 11. We might see something like Windows 10 here while it's in that discovery phase, and that's just because those initial fingerprints from Windows 11 look very similar to Windows 10. So don't be too worried, it's expected. It will update once that pre-discovery is completed to the appropriate version there. But we can see right now it is online, so it's connected, that's great. We can see it's got 0 apps, which is not true. So we're gonna wait for that to do its thing and take that inventory. It is just a blank vanilla AWS image, so it doesn't have too much on it, but it's certainly not 0. And we see it's low risk. again, that's probably going to change as well once the application inventory comes back. Being that this is Server 2025, everything should be, pretty up to date, but I'm curious what we'll get back on this. This is actually my first time deploying it on Server 2025, so that'll be a little bit of an experiment for me too. Now, obviously, when we're doing the deployment, we don't want to go to every single machine and run that PowerShell command or run that bash script or anything like that, right? I remember I had a call with a school district. I'm not sure if the partner is on here, but if you know who you are, you'll know the story. They said, is it SneakerNet? And it took me a second. I was thinking like a tool, and he meant running to each and every device. So yeah, that was kind of a funny moment when I made that realization. But yeah, we don't want to use SneakerNet. We want to do something that's very scalable. Again, if you've done a SaaS deployment before, you're probably familiar with some of these options, but I'm going to go through a couple of them just to kind of show some of the different techniques that we have. And before I get into those, actually, it is worth mentioning, how do we identify which one we want to use? Well, that's something that, again, we do rely on our partners to kind of have that relationship with the customers in a lot of cases and know what their environment looks like, especially the MSPs. You guys are providing that service. You're working very closely. In a lot of cases, you probably built their environment and maintain it and know it better than the end customer. So and a lot of times you also have an RMM installed there, and that's a great way to install it because we can just run that command remotely from your RMM, the PowerShell command, or any other type, the CMD, for example, or Bash for some of the other ones. So so that's one option, and we do have all of these listed in our knowledge base articles here. So basically just choose whatever method you're looking to use, and we've got a corresponding article, and that's also something that we'll cover in the POC and in the onboarding with the customer success team. So it's not solely up to you, but it is great if we kind of have that initial mapping of the environment. What is the architecture like before we go into that? It really helps to speed up that process. A couple other methods. So let's say it's not an MSP model. Let's say you're from a distributor where you don't have that RMM, or the customer doesn't have their own RMM. Using things like group policy can be very useful. If they have an Active Directory environment like this one here is that I've got in this lab, setting up a group policy to deploy the script on a login script is something that's quite simple to set up. A lot of sysadmins, I should say, are very familiar with group policies. It doesn't require any additional tooling. It's also a great way to maintain that in an ongoing basis. So anytime you join something to the domain, depending on your group policy settings, it's going to automatically deploy that agent. So that's a really great persistent way of doing this. Intune is another one. A lot of places are moving to Intune or have already adopted Intune. Definitely the way Microsoft is pushing things. So using that to push out the application. There's a couple different nuances with Intune in the way that it's done. They use the Wintune 32 app format, which we can basically just convert our executable, which you can get here. So that's one way, or we can just use their scripting module to run that script remotely. I find the Wintune 32 works a bit better. Intune scripting leaves a bit to be desired. The response times can be a little bit all over the place in my experience. So the Wintune app tends to be kind of the winner in that regard, but both are available. So you can choose your favorite there. Other deployment methods include things like SCCM. For Mac environments, there's also MDMs, Jamf, Mosel, Rippling, all of these different Mac, mobile deployment tools. We can pretty much treat those as an RMM almost, where we're just going to be running that script remotely. Again, typically a few nuances, depends on the specific tooling, your stack that you're using, where we might need to customize the script slightly. Especially with Mac, there is a lot of variety between different operating systems and between different MDMs. So that one is one to keep an eye out for, where we might need to just do a little bit more planning on that initial deployment. It also might require a bit more testing with the customer's environment, but that is something that we do have really good coverage of as well. Another deployment option is the vDeployer. So this is a great option when customers don't have their own deployment methodology, or let's say they do have group policy, but group policy, like I mentioned, the main way that we use it is through a login script. So we'd have to run a GP update, we'd have to reboot the machine, we'd have to log back into it. It can take time. So again, it's really great for persistent workloads where we might run this over the course of the year for any new machines that get added to the fleet. But what do we do when we want to do that initial deployment, that initial push, right? Maybe we don't want to wait for that. So vDeployer is a great option for that. We've got a Linux flavor and a Windows flavor, and we're going to be covering the Windows one today. So I've got that pulled up here. Let's minimize this. And actually, we see one of my machines is not connecting, so I'll have to go and troubleshoot that. But it is something worth talking about because these things do tend to happen from time to time. So we need to understand how we can troubleshoot that. But vDeployer is basically a tool which is going to be pushing out our executable with WMI. So usually when we do see an issue with it, it tends to be WMI or SMB related. In this case, I'm running it from a domain controller, and I've got the 3 main files that are related to it all running from the desktop. They just need to be in the same folder. So maybe you want to create a Vicarius deployment folder or something like that. But as long as these are all in the same location, the same directory, everything should function just fine. I've also got this IP CSV. So these are the 2 machines that I have in the lab environment apart from this domain controller that we're logged into currently. So I've just pulled their IPs and I've just saved this as a CSV, just separating those by a comma. Again, this is something that we have a couple different methods of doing. If you have your the host names of each of the machines, which is something that you can pull from Active Directory. You could just do an export of that, and we could import that into vDeployer. Or maybe you don't know each and every IP. So here's a couple that we have in this case, and we could just do an export of that and import that into vDeployer. That's another option. Maybe you want to use your DHCP scope. So we can do a range, we can do a subnet. But just for this lab environment, I've just chosen those 2 just to keep things very simple. In terms of the deployment, we'll need to plug in a few things. If you recall back to that PowerShell method I showed a few moments ago, it's pretty much mapped to those, right? So it's going to be the host name, which is the Vicarius URL that you have. So it'll be your customer name or your MSP name .vicarius.cloud. So we'll plug that in, and then we'll plug in the secret key. So let's go and grab that from our dashboard. So I'm going to copy this out. I'm going to open up a notepad here, and I'm going to grab the secret key out of it. And that one is going to look something like that. Now for the host name, we do need to grab that also from the deployment script. So let's go ahead and grab that one. It's going to actually be a little bit different than how it's listed in the deployment script. So let me just actually pull this up quickly here. So this is going to be, here's the knowledge base article for the vDeployer, and we can also see what that would look like in Excel with the CSV as well. But this is what the URL needs to look like. So it's going to be the company name -API gateway.vicarius.cloud. So it's a little bit different than just kind of if you were to go in your browser. And that's just to point the agents for the initial deployment. So let's go ahead and grab that, and let's go back to our vDeployer. And let's plug that in, and we're just going to replace the my company with, what did I name this? I think it's North America Tech Training or something like that. Just a moment. All right, so I've got that, and I'm going to actually just replace this whole thing. There we go. So I've already run the scan. The scan can take some time, especially if it can't connect to it. It's going to, try it a couple times before it does fail. But you can run a scan. And what's also nice about that is you can do an export. So you can get a report on what is the saturation of the agent. It'll report back, in this case, if it can't reach it. It'll report back if it's ready to be installed or if it's already installed. So you will know the kind of coverage ratios from this tool, which is quite nice. So that's from the scan option. There's a couple other options here. We can do the deployment, which is what we're going to go ahead and do. We can also modify it. So maybe we want to use the MSI. The MSI is something that is for our older agents. It is something that it's effectively legacy right now, and we are eventually going to be sunsetting. But if you are running a V4 agent for whatever reason, most of you shouldn't be, but there are a couple outlier cases where that's needed. We do have that option here. The proxy server, we talked about this earlier, and the benefits of how that can help us with caching of the patches to reduce our network bandwidth. It can also help us with the network security. So maybe we want to add that at the time of deployment. We're not going to do a proxy setup today, but if we were to use that, we would basically just set up an Ubuntu virtual machine. This will also be in the March Advanced Technical Training, the hands-on. So if you do want to learn more, please look out for that. Like I said, but we can go ahead and add the IP or the DNS name of that proxy server. And again, that's going to be an Ubuntu machine. We have some files and OVA for that. We have all the scripts that are needed. So it's a very easy setup. But we would just plug in, again, either the IP or the DNS name for that machine along with the port. There might be cases where we want to do multiple proxies. We can do that as well for failover or for, kind of load balancing purposes. So there's not a single point of failure. So those are all different considerations that we would take during the onboarding process. So we're going to go ahead and remove that one for now. Endpoint tags. So maybe we want to group the assets in a very specific way. And maybe we don't really have that mapped out in the environment currently. We don't have OUs. We don't have AD groups that are usable. Maybe the machines just don't meet any common criteria in a repeatable way. So using endpoint tags can kind of help us make sense of that at the time of deployment. And it just gives us another option with the asset grouping, which we'll be showing in just a moment here. So yeah, it looks like we're all set. We can also do a repair. So if we've got some issues with an agent and we want to, kind of just overwrite some of those things, we can choose the repair option, or we can do a modification of some of the parameters. Maybe we want to change a config. We'll be able to do that from the dashboard once we have the agent running, but we can also do it from vDeployer as well. So let's go ahead and run that deployment. We'll see what we get, live demo, so you never know. But yeah, let's give that a moment. In the meantime, since we know we had an issue with that one machine, we actually see 2 successes. So maybe one of the changes I made with the security group just took a little while there earlier, but that's even better. A couple things I would check, so this was the one that showed a problem on the scan. Let's make sure we can ping it. Let's go to the machine. Let's see if, maybe something with the Windows firewall. If it's domain joined, there shouldn't be a firewall issue, but maybe let's check if we can reach the domain controller from the machine, make sure DNS is good, make sure that we can SMB is enabled. All of these types of things are what we would want to look at there. But this is great. We see that both of those are successfully installed. So that is what we are looking for. And that means that we should see those in the dashboard here, and we do. So that you can see how quick that process is. We do see on the server 25, we've only got about 10 apps. Like I said, that's just kind of a vanilla, AWS AMI. So not too surprised. I would have expected maybe a little bit more, but we do still see it's low risk. Let's see what we get on these. If not, maybe we'll install Chrome or Firefox or something like that to give us some more data there. Couple things. So, we kind of covered the deployment process, a couple different options so far. I mentioned opening the dashboard. So I do want to cover a couple things with opening a dashboard, both for partners and both as well as for MSPs. So MSPs, we find they are sometimes doing subtenants within the same dashboard, or sometimes they're doing a mix where their customers need a separate dashboard. Maybe they have a very sensitive data set and it needs to be totally segmented from the other environment. So they want to split that off, but they still want to be able to log into them, to both dashboards. So we've got a couple different ways of doing that. We do see in the dashboard, there's a couple different ways that we can basically provision that tenant at the time of deployment. So that's actually going to be in the user management function. We call these teams. If you are an MSP, you'll probably know them by site, which is how most RMMs refer to them, something like that nomenclature. So we call them teams again, and that's because we work with a lot of end customers as well. So teams tends to make a bit more sense for the end customer. Server team, workstation team, security team, so on. But this is basically our subtenancy within the dashboard here. So we can create a team. Let's call this the training team. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a subtenant asset group at the time of deployment. So this is going to give us it's basically going to provision everything that's needed for that subtenancy process all in one sort of place. So we don't have to go and perform multiple different steps and everything like that. So this makes this very, very simple for MSP deployments. We also can add the proxy, we can do all of these different things. But what we can see is this is automatically going to provision that endpoint tag that I talked about to a custom deployment script for that customer. We've talked to a couple MSPs, I think a few are here, about site variables and things like that. We can make this a variable, and you can do some pretty cool things and advanced things within your RMM, which is pulling that in to make this even more scalable. But the process, in its simplest form, looks something like this. So we can see we've got the endpoint tag, we've got the value. This is basically tenant and customer name. So in this case, it's just the training team. We could modify that if we'd like. We can also add some additional components to this. I mentioned earlier how we added the CPU core limit. So this is a control that we can use to help us make sure that we're not going beyond any CPU usage limits, making sure that that agent is staying very lightweight, even in some more resource-intensive activities that they might apply. So even if they do turn on the patchless protection for every single app, which is not advisable, we can kind of control that and limit it through this. Anti-tampering, this is also something that's relatively new. So we want to make sure that users can't uninstall the agent very easily, right? It is fairly hidden. There's, really, I think only the technical types of users will be able to find any trace of the agent. Kind of the reboot pop-up is the exception to that. But aside from that, it's very silent. There's no system tray icon. There's no nothing in the start menu or anything like that. There's a service. There's a program files folder. Of course, I'm talking about Windows here, but Linux and Mac are relatively similar, where it's very hidden. But maybe we do want to add that additional check and not just use obfuscation as our security. So we want to add that additional anti-tampering component. We do have that capability, and that's going to require a password for the uninstall as well. So we'll choose all of those, and we see if we scroll down here, we've got a command that gives us basically that built into it. So we can see that at the end here, we've got this /endpoint tag, and that's going to have the training team built into it. So that is what that one would look like if we were doing a deployment, a fresh deployment, a new customer is being onboarded. We can use this script. Now, let's say we've already done our deployment and maybe we didn't plan the subtenancy stuff out. We just wanted to get everything installed. It's all kind of, in one bucket. It's all in the one tenant. What we can do is we can run this this command here, which is going to write to the config file with that endpoint tag. So that will just basically overwrite what we already have in the endpoint config, and that's going to allow us to map that to our subtenant. Another thing that we can do is we can choose which users are going to be able to manage that, who can view it, who can access it. Some MSP customers are going to be co-managed. You don't want your co-managed, on-site IT person to be able to see all of your other customers' assets. So we want to make sure that that's partitioned off and, kind of hidden from them. So they can only see the assets that belong to them and, basically can act in their jurisdiction, but not beyond that. So we can invite those users. We can also determine their role. Maybe the contract you have with them is, that you're performing everything, and we want to adhere to principle of least privilege. So we just want them to be a viewer. They can log in, they can look, but they can't touch. They can't do anything. They can see that we're, as the MSP, we're doing our job. We're securing them. They can generate reports. They can look at logs. They can look at trends, but they can't actually perform patches. They can't take down their own network. Admin, it's a little bit different. They can perform patches, they can perform scripts. So, those are going to be your more technical, customers that you're working with, where they do kind of have that shared responsibility. Owner is going to be pretty much a super user. So owner can do everything below, in addition to being able to manage users, create subtenants, also integrations. Maybe you want to create a new API integration. We're going to see an example of that shortly here. So the owner is the privilege level that's required to be able to do those types of things. In this case, I'm just going to add my user to this environment, but again, we could add some additional users if we'd like. So let's go ahead and create that. And now we see a success. And if we go up to the top here, we can see I've got a new team. So I've got the primary team, which is basically my global view. It's everything. If I've got multiple customers here, I've got multiple sites, I'll see everything in the primary team. In the training team, I'll only see the assets that have been assigned to that. There's a couple other ways to do it, but we've added this method of building that subtenant at the time of the user just to really simplify everything and make it very cohesive and kind of all one fell swoop. Another thing that's nice for MSPs is we added some co-branding in the dashboard. So you can add your customer's logo and then you can add your MSP logo. So if you do have those co-managed ones, they'll see that, both their own logo as well as yours throughout, and that'll be on every subtenant. So those are a couple different MSP use cases. Hopefully that all made sense. I do want to talk a little bit about the partners, non-MSPs. The way that you are working with customers is going to be a little bit different. So generally, and actually this applies to MSPs who kind of that second category I mentioned earlier with the customers who need a new dashboard. They need to be totally segmented. So we've got a couple different ways of creating new dashboards. In the past, we've used the trial link. This is something that we are still using, but we'll probably be phasing out. In the meantime, you can certainly use that, but we do suggest using either our partner portal. This is for MSPs who are co-managing or they're, have those split out customers. It's basically a tenant that allows us to, looks like I got signed out here, but let's go ahead and get another invite so we can just do a brief tour on that. While I'm waiting for that, I'll show you what we're moving towards, which is our PRM. We're actually in the process of a global release or global rollout of this. So some of you will have seen it. Some of you probably will very soon if you haven't already. And this is where you can register deals, and we're going to be sharing micro learning. So I mentioned a couple features that are coming out. Instead of joining the next training, maybe you just have time to 10, 15 minutes to look at a new feature. We'll be sharing those types of things here, as well as a lot of other resources, training calendars even. So it's a really great place to kind of just stay in the loop with all things Vicarius. But in terms of opening a dashboard, let's say we've got a new deal. Registering a deal is always what we want to go for. That's going to give you the deal protection. It's also going to open the dashboard. So this connects into our CRM, and we have got some workflows that basically will kick off that dashboard opening. So you'll just fill in the details here. I'm not going to walk through all of them. I think most people who are with those types of distributors and VARs, you're probably familiar with the deal registration process. So you'll go through, you'll work with the customer to understand this. You'll submit it. It'll be assigned to your territory sales rep, and then they'll work with you on scheduling the POC kickoff, understanding their needs, so on and so forth, and kind of beginning that process. But it is also going to open the dashboard, so that kind of helps us accelerate that as well with the POC. vConnect, it's largely similar to that. Again, just kind of gives us the addition of being able to log into the dashboards. So that's a little bit more hands-on, a little bit more of a technical sort of partner than the PRM here. Cool. So back to the dashboard. So let's take a look at what we've got. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And we see we've got all three assets. All three of those are new. We do have one in high risk, so that's good. I don't have to do too many app installations there to get one. Looks like the vanilla AMI was enough. We do see that there's a couple patches. They both happen to be in the NA category, but we can see that right off the bat that we do have a couple things that we need to do in order to get that machine, fully up to date. I'm sure if this was a production system, this would be a pretty different scenario where we'd have far more applications, far more patches. That tends to be the theme. One thing that's pretty funny, I mentioned earlier about installing the agent on, whoever's leading the POC from the customer side, installing the agent on their machine first. Usually those are IT people, they're security people. They've got tools like Wireshark and, maybe, some code editors, VS Code, things like that. So they tend to be in high risk in a lot of cases because they have those applications that have vulnerabilities and have an attack surface that your typical user might not have. So that's always something that I think is pretty fun with that initial kickoff to kind of uncover those. And that's also going to have a higher number of patches and things that we can do. So so those are a couple of points for that initial deployment phase. One thing that we can do with the vulnerability discovery, we haven't performed any mitigations yet. We also don't have our trend line yet. That'll come in once some time has passed. We just kind of have this initial detection phase, but we see there's quite a few detection events. Let's see how many vulnerabilities do we have? Only 47 actually so far. So again, probably just a testament to those being pretty vanilla machines. They don't have a whole lot going on, but they do still have vulnerabilities. So if you go to AWS, spin up a machine, there's still some work to be done on that fresh out of the box, unit that you have. So when this number is, far higher, that obviously kind of leads us into from the detection phase to the assessment phase. How do we make sense of that? We don't want to just look at external factors. They are very helpful in understanding kind of a baseline, but they don't tell the whole story, the context, how the application, how the asset is being used is important to that. It increases or decreases the likelihood that that vulnerability might be exploited. The severity, that's more just how bad would it be? What would be the impact if that vulnerability were to be exploited? But we don't know, it could be something that's in a segmented VLAN in a sandbox. It could be something that the vulnerability is very theoretical. It's only able to be performed in a very controlled lab setting where no one in the real world would actually use the application in that way. So that's what we want to kind of, peel back the layers on and have a better understanding of what that might actually mean in a real world setting. We use what we call X tags for this. There's a couple different vectors that we're checking. These machines, they don't have a whole lot going on, and the X tags are only going to be specific to what exists in that environment. Maybe we'll switch over to my usual demo environment, which has far more data in a moment, so you can see what that would look like in a more filled out environment. But kind of just talking about what this is aiming to do is we're looking at the context. Where do those vulnerabilities exist in the environment? How are those applications being used? How are those assets being used? Again, was it moved to a DMZ? Is it sending and receiving traffic over external interfaces? Is the application running 24/7? Is it running with high privileges? And then we're also looking beyond that at threat intelligence. Is that vulnerability actually being used in the wild? Very few vulnerabilities are actually exploited in the wild. They're, again, just kind of that controlled lab setting. So mapping that out, understanding where your focuses should lie is going to, help you move the needle. It's going to help you use the limited resources that you have in the most effective way. It's going to help us get that confidence in your remediation phase to a higher number. Like we saw earlier, we've got that, kind of 9% right now. We want to get that much higher. And this is part of what's going to help us do that. So threat intelligence, we're looking at the vector. Is it a remote command execution, a denial of service? Is the vulnerability on the CISA KEV? All sorts of different data points here that help us to kind of paint that picture. And what we see is we've actually only got one high-risk application in this environment. So we might have, almost 50 CVEs on these 3 machines. But really, if we can go to this one application, what happens to be .NET, not too surprising because, if we look at the number of vulnerabilities that we have detected, a lot of these are for .NET. Quite a few, actually, almost all of them. So we do see that that is the high-risk application in this environment. And again, in a larger environment, you'll see that that's not always the case. There might be an application with dozens of vulnerabilities, but they're not really exploitable in the way that it's implemented, and it's going to be a lower risk as a result. So being much more dynamic, considering those things, very, very important to informing those remediation decisions. So looking at this, we can see we've got the one high risk app, we've got 17 low risk, none in medium actually. But what the platform is going to do is it's going to look to see what are the different threats and what are the different mitigations available. So it's going to map out a couple different steps that you can take in order to mitigate that vulnerability. So you don't have to go and research every single vulnerability, on NVD or Bleeping Computer or CVE.org or MITRE or wherever. The platform is going to take a lot of information, synthesize it down to a couple simple steps that you can take in order to protect yourself. So it really, cuts out a lot of the legwork and research work that might go into that. We can see in this case there's a patch available. So if there's a patch available, that's a pretty low-hanging fruit. That's something that the vendor has released in order to mitigate that vulnerability. It's going to remove that piece of code that can be exploited. That's not always the case. We talked about a couple examples of that earlier, where the patchless protection comes into play, where the scripts for the configuration based vulnerabilities come into play. And we'll cover those in just a little bit here. So we have the patches available. we've got some exposed APIs. This is contributing to the high risk as well. And we've got well-known vulnerabilities. We saw that in the detection events. So in this case, let's go ahead and install that patch. I'm going to do this in a one-time manner, kind of an ad hoc, just because we want to deploy this immediately. But something that is worth covering is also the automations. I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is very, very repeatable. Chrome patches, Adobe patches, Microsoft Patch Tuesday, all sorts of applications have a very high number of patches being released on a repeatable manner, and they're applications that Windows might not necessarily fall into this, but things like Chrome, your browsers, your PDF readers, they're not going to have a large impact in the environment in most cases, they're not going to have a large impact in the environment if you're patching them. So you want to apply those patches very quickly. They might not fall into your more rigorous change management, methods that very strict production environments might have, where you're testing out patches in dev or test and then pushing them to prod. So they're really good candidates for automation. So we can pretty much do anything that we can do in the automations in the ad hoc one-off patching. The main difference is that the ad hoc is more intended for, let's say, a critical vulnerability comes out, and our next patch window with the automation isn't until the weekend, but came down from security, came down from management, that we want to patch that immediately because it just has such a high risk score. So we might use that to just push that out on a one-time basis. We might also use that if we're doing a deployment and we want to baseline everything. We want to make sure everything is running a certain version of an application or newer before it goes into production. Maybe we've got a golden image, but we want to get that stuff updated before going into production. So we might use the one-off patching in some of those cases. Everything else, the automation is going to be your best friend. One thing that's nice about the automation, well, several things, is, and here we can see, just kind of going through an example of that, is we're picking the apps that we want to patch. So in this case, I'm just going to grab both of these. We can see all of the applications in the environment by choosing this toggle. And in a lot of cases, we see that these don't have patches available. Just a little bit about these numbers. So we see there's one asset running this, these applications. So some of these have 0 actually. Which is a bit interesting. Maybe it's still doing the pre-discovery there. But what that would typically mean is the number of devices running that application, how many of those devices need a patch, and then how many patches are available. And we can open that up and we can see what is the specific patch that's needed. So those are a couple of the different metrics we have there. When we're looking at buy all apps, it's just kind of removing that filter of having a patch available right away. And why that's important is, with an automation, as I mentioned, it's repeatable. We're going to be running that months, years even. So just because that application doesn't have a patch today doesn't mean it's not going to in a week, in a month, in a year. So that's something that we want to be a little bit more forward thinking. But I like to do, for example's sake, just so we have some data, going with this method here. Much smaller number as well, so that's pretty handy. So I'll select both of those. We'll then choose our settings. Do we want to patch all severities? In this case, I know that the .NET one is NA severity. I believe the other one is as well. So we're definitely leave that on there, but certainly, for my MSP days, I recall, excluding some of those lower severity patches from the policies. And the reason for that is because, they have just as much likelihood of breaking production and causing tickets and downtime and upset customers as some of the high risk patches, but the security trade-off isn't there. So, that's certainly something that I've seen as a consideration. I'm sure some of you have as well. In this case, again, we're going to leave all of those, and that's certainly something we see. Different parts of the environment, that's a consideration as well. What are we targeting? We're going to get to that in a moment here, but you might want to, apply some different settings to your workstations than you want to your servers. So that's something to keep in mind with the way that we configure this. In some environments, you need that higher level of control for this. You can't just go based on severity. This isn't the best example because these are two different applications, but they are both NA severity. They're not, a security patch. So, if we had that NA severity selected, that would mean that both of these get applied. Maybe this one's the only one that's been approved by our change management. So we want to specify explicitly which package is being deployed to the machine. The specific patch method that we have here is what's going to allow us to do that. But again, we're going to proceed this way. I do find that the severity, it's much more scalable because it's much more automated. It does take some of the decision out of it. Um, Again, there's that trade-off there. We're actually going to be adding a feature probably the first half of this year, certainly this year, where we'll kind of marry those two and we'll give you the best of both worlds with some really complex rules and triggers and actions for the automation. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. Auto reboot. So, this is a huge point of contention for patches is users don't like rebooting. IT admins, might not like rebooting servers, at 2 in the morning when they'd rather be, doing other things. Obviously, you can schedule it. But anyway, reboots are something that everyone likes to handle differently. Nobody likes to do it. So building the auto reboot in, it is kind of that double-edged sword. We need to do it, but we want to do so in a way that considers not only the security, but also the operational considerations, maintaining uptime, maintaining critical services. We're going to talk about scheduling, so maintenance windows, but how do we kind of find that balance? And again, it's different for everybody. Basically, the way that we handle reboots is that we'll check to see if the reboot's required for the patches that are in this job. So in this case, we've got the 2 patches that we know are going to be covered by NA. So we know that those are going to be installed. We don't know yet if they will need a reboot, but the platform will check that. When it installs them, it'll report back that that patch is in a notice state because it's pending reboot. We can actually do some really cool things with the asset groups around that. But basically, once that reports that status back, it's going to tell the user, or it's going to tell the platform rather, hey, this is what the admin configured. They'd like to trigger the reboot automatically, and they'd like to allow the user to postpone that so that they have some time to save their work. They're not too caught off guard. Maybe something like 4 hours. So it's still being patched in a timely manner, but the user still has ample time to finish up whatever it is they need to. We've got a couple other ways of configuring that. We can accelerate the process if there's no user session, or maybe the users are trained to log off and they don't reboot at the end of the day on their own. So just going ahead and performing that reboot on a user log off will help us to accelerate that. And, we can see that there's quite a few different options to help us work around some of those common, reboot scenarios. Allowing the user to cancel, that's a deferral. So that's going to pretty much stop this clock. If you give them that option, they'll have a third option in their pop-up window, which will allow them to cancel, as the name implies. That's going to stop the reboot process entirely. It is going to keep that patch cache there so that the next manual reboot, be it the user doing it, be it the RMM, be it group policy, what have you, even another automation, if you want to decouple the patching and the reboots, that's something we have a really detailed knowledge base on for an advanced use case. That way you do still have that patch cached. It's just waiting for the reboot so that the file is unlocked that it needs to access in order to overwrite, or whatever the reason for that reboot might be. It's less common in application patches that any of this is needed, but it is important to understand how that mechanism functions. Speaking of cases where the reboot is more needed, operating system updates. So we do actually have some that came through here. So let's go ahead and select for server 19 and 22. I'll grab both of those, and it's basically just a rinse and repeat from from this, what we saw in the application updates. What you might have, I kind of sped through there, is we can add multiple stages to the automation, which allows us to build those into one automation rather than maintaining multiple. We can schedule that on the same target systems. We can schedule that at the same time. So that can be very useful in a lot of cases. So really, it's pretty much the exact same things I covered in the application updates, but just applied to a different target of operating system updates. Again, the OS updates are just that much more likely to need a reboot. Scripting. So we talked about earlier the patching, not being the full coverage, right? There's a lot of vulnerabilities that need something else to be applied. And that is something that can be difficult for a lot of people. We actually have a threat research team, which is looking at these vulnerabilities. We have a community, vSociety. Our other, non-threat research teams, myself, Jordan, Zach, Griffin, the international team as well, are contributing these. So this is giving our customers access to resources that they probably wouldn't otherwise have. A lot of, especially smaller SMBs, they don't have access to a threat researcher. They don't have access to developers, to people who are well versed in PowerShell and Python and Bash and ZSH and all of these different languages, they don't have the time to go and research vulnerabilities. What is the specific config that's affected? How do I mitigate it? How do I mitigate it in a way that doesn't disrupt anything? So we're giving that access to all of our customers in the form of our public catalog here. So we've got a scripting engine which can run remotely on all of those devices we have our agent on, and you can create your own script. You can use one of ours as a template. You'll see a lot of them are tagged for vulnerabilities that will help you detect a vulnerability. Let's view this one. So we can see a description of it. If I scroll down, I can see this is what the script is doing. Looks like it's just checking for a specific Outlook version. I think this is actually our CVE of the week this week, which is something you might have seen on LinkedIn, where we share some, kind of spotlight research on a trending vulnerability. Outlook vulnerabilities are always frustrating. Exchange, Office, I think we've all dealt with those. So looks like we're checking for a specific version, and then we're running. We're also looking for a specific registry key as well. So we're checking both. Do they have that version? Do they have that specific registry key? If so, then if all those checks kind of come back, this is just one example, of course, then we'll report back that that vulnerability is in fact present on the machine, and then you'll know that you have to take some remediation action, basically. So let's go back, and we also see on the flip side we've got a remediation. So what we can then do with that information from the detection is translate that into a remediation action. So let's go and basically correct that, right? Let's make sure that that is removed. Maybe it's a registry key that needs to be changed. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a patch that is not included in those 10,000 applications that we support, and we need to pull in that executable and deploy it to the machine. So there's quite a lot of flexibility in this, quite a lot of use case coverage, and certainly something that we find our customers are rightfully so taking a lot of advantage of, because again, this is a blind spot for a lot of organizations. Here we can see, if we wanted to add that script, we could just simply go and add it. Very simple. If we wanted to modify it, we could copy it, make some modifications to it. We work with a lot of different sectors, a lot of different organizations. Sometimes they use applications differently than other ones. We can't account for every single one of those. We can test it in our own environments, and we do. But you might want to test it out. You might want to modify it. You're certainly able to do that, and see what it's doing, make those modifications. So that is certainly something that comes into play. Going to go ahead and remove that for now. So let's actually, let's run with this automation here. Let's go ahead and run a vulnerability that I think will probably be present on some of these machines, which is 2013. This one here, I might have to remove this. I've worked with a few partners on this and customers, so if you're on here, you'll recognize this one. But this is a vulnerability that affects most versions of Windows, and it's registry-based vulnerability. So let's go ahead and check that. And we're going to add that to our action list. So we've got some patches going on. We've got some scripts going on. Let's run that script first, because the patches are probably going to take a little bit longer to download. They might cause us to run over. So let's try to get that, that script really quickly. The last thing for the actual actions here are going to be the reports. So these are really useful in conveying different metrics to the different stakeholders. It could be a technical team that you want to share an activity log report. What were the patch statuses? Did they succeed? Did they fail? Why did they fail? And being able to go and troubleshoot those effectively. So we'll have, maybe a return code, or maybe a couldn't download because the URL is blocked on their network to a vendor repo, let's say. So that type of information is found in the log report. So yeah, as I was saying, we've got some technical reports, we've got some executive reports. Those are going to be a little bit more visual, trends over time. They're PDF based, so much more high level versus the more granular technical reports. And they both have different audiences, of course. Some of the reports are more IT focused, some are more security focused. They really cover a lot of the areas that we've seen in the tool so far. And in a few moments, Jordan is going to give us a little preview of another reporting option, which is very powerful. So last couple things with this automation, and then we'll carry on with that. I'm going to target the all asset group, which has all three assets in it. I didn't add any to this team, but we can see there's 0 in there currently. If I were to add them, that would allow me to apply patches to one group of assets versus another and kind of take in those different maintenance windows and, inventories into account. I'm just going to run this on the 3 because it's a very small environment. Again, taking a few liberties here, we're just going to run this now in the interest of time, but what we find is very valuable in a real world setting is setting these to run on a recurring basis. Again, um, you know, PDF readers, browsers, things like that, where we're constantly having to battle those patches. It's a time sink. It's causing a huge vulnerability count to be added to, some of our metrics. And it's taking a lot of time. So we want to automate that. We would set that to run maybe daily, maybe weekly, monthly, custom. That's great for Patch Tuesday, where it's happening on the same exact time every single month. So we want to schedule around that. So there's quite a few different ways that we can set this up to run to take those different situations into account. Again, I'm just going to run this one now. We do have the time zone consideration. It's just taking the local browser time zone. So if you have some devices in a different time zone, you can set that. Rolling execution, basically just instead of patching a very large number of devices all at one time, it's going to allow us to do that in basically bite-sized pieces. So we can limit the bandwidth usage. So again, we're not going to turn that on now just because we want things to run as quickly as possible. So let's click finish. We'll do a review. We see we're running that detection script. We see we're patching these applications. We are going to do the auto reboot on that one. I don't suspect it'll go into action, but it is there. And then we've got those OS patches. So let's go ahead and activate and continue. And then that's going to kick that job off. We will see that here in the automation view, which is the first thing it's going to bring us to. We can view the summary just to, maybe we've got a whole bunch of automations. We forget which one is which. I should probably label that too. That's certainly something I would suggest in a real world setting. So we can have like a friendly name that we can recognize that in logs and reports. We can see it's only running once, but it is running indefinitely, meaning that it's going to continue running until it either succeeds or fails on all the devices in the scope, which is that all asset group. So one thing to consider is to set an end time for that. I didn't do that in this case because I just want to kick it off immediately. It's a lab setting, so again, taking some liberties there. But in order to cut down on jobs that are in that running status, setting an end time, kind of having a determined time between 2 and 3 p.m. or 2 and 4 p.m. or 1 and 5 a.m., something like that, where those jobs are going to be running, they're going to expire, then they're going to run again, at the next occurrence, maybe catching any stragglers, that sort of thing. This running it in this way can be useful in some scenarios where maybe the machines are offline a lot of the time. Maybe you've got some field technicians or something like that. That's something we hear from time to time. And you want to patch those immediately once they come online. Having a job that's persistent like this, where it's going to continue trying to run, can be useful in some of those scenarios. But I would just use them sparingly because, again, it can be a little bit confusing in the logs when you see some things in the running status. So that is something to bear in mind. We'll also see if we go to the logs, these things are already being kicked off. We can see the script we've already got some progress on. So in this case, we have a command that's executed successfully, and in this case as well. And actually, both of these are not vulnerable to that vulnerability. So maybe because they're newer operating systems, that has been fixed, which is good because it's from 2013, so it should be. We still have one that's waiting, so we'll see on that one if we get any. But what we could do if we were to get that vulnerability as present is we could then run the remediation, which is going to take care of that for us, and it's going to apply that configuration change. Once the script runs, these are just going to run in sequence, again, depending on the package size, depending on the bandwidth. They may be very quick. If it's a small patch, it may take a little bit more time. If it's a gig or so, the proxy really comes in to help us a lot there in those cases. But in general, that's how we can set up an automation, how we can track it. Let's say we get a failure. This is something I want to touch on because that does happen from time to time, especially in new environments where we haven't tried the patching out yet. It's kind of like doing this live demo here where maybe it'll fail. What are things we can check? Well, first of all, I mentioned earlier that we will get a failure notification. So this will flip over to failed if that does in fact happen. And in the info, it depends on the vendor. Some are more verbose than others. We'll get some information on that. In the case of Microsoft, it would probably be a return code. And those are, Microsoft's return code. So those are just things we can Google. We do have a KB on decoding some of those as well. And that's going to give us, a pretty clear reason in most cases why that failure occurred so that we can correct that. Could be that it's out of disk space, it can't fit the patch. So, things like that. In the case of applications, it's a little bit more varying. We see this one's actually already started, so that's great. And again, it's going to depend on the verbosity of the vendor. Sometimes there's a little bit more information, sometimes less. There is a bit of variety there, unfortunately, but it is kind of at the mercy of how good of a job the patch vendor did on getting those failure logs. One thing we can do is we can go to the local logs. Now, if you're running a POC, chances are, again, you're working with one of our team members or several, and we're going to be able to support you through that process. And we have tools to allow us to pull those logs remotely. But basically on Windows anyway, and it's similar for Mac and Linux, just the locations are different and the ways we would get them are slightly different, but there's a program files folder. So we can go to C, program files, pulling up my file explorer now, and then we'll go to Topia, which if anyone's been partnered with us for a while, will know that's the previous name of the tool before vRx. So little Easter egg, I guess. And then we can go to this Topia trace log here. And that's going to be where we can troubleshoot why that patch has, potentially failed. So here's what that looks like. As soon as this loads, there we go. Not too friendly to look at, I do agree, but if you know what to look for, and again, that's something that we'll help you with. So definitely please do reach out to us if you do encounter that, especially at scale. If we're seeing a lot of failures, we're usually proactively checking this as well, but we do obviously depend on our partners to let us know how things are going with the customer as well. So yeah, it's something to be aware of. You probably won't have to get too familiar with that, hopefully, but that is one way that we can troubleshoot that a little bit more. So I do see the time here. I want to save a little bit for questions, and Jordan's got a really exciting session. So I think with that, if I can find my tab here, we are going to one of these. There we go. We're going to go through the professional services. So I hope everyone enjoyed the lab portion. We're going to go into a little bit of another lab here, but we want to kind of officially announce the professional services team. Let me add Jordan to the stage here. There you go. Jordan's going to tell us a little bit about professional services. He's going to go through a little bit of a practical walkthrough of vAnalyzer. In a nutshell, and not to steal too much thunder, but just to kind of tee him up here, professional services is something that we're going to basically kind of where the platform stops for really complex use cases. We're going to bridge that gap. So, Jordan's able to build out some really cool, complex tools, and he's going to show us one of those today. So, yeah, over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and kind of dive right in here. As far as kind of the professional services goes and vAnalyzer, we have kind of built out a tool to be able to integrate with the API and the vRx API and pull that data and then present it in a way that is kind of actionable, and we can kind of create KPIs and different metrics and kind of go from there. So I'll go ahead and share kind of my screen on that. Up. Let's see. Alrighty. There we go. But like I said, it's an API integration, so we're pulling all of the data within vRx out of the API and then storing it in a local database. From there, it's kind of, we can do a couple different things. We can integrate with Power BI. We can integrate with any other kind of business intelligence tool to kind of track KPIs, create dashboards, and kind of track metrics. So let's just kind of the database view or table view of the database, all the different kind of tables, and we can kind of see how we're structuring that data. If we go from here, we can kind of go in and look at some of our vulnerability management data. This is going to probably, this is just kind of all of our sample graphs and metrics, but you can see we can kind of calculate a wide range of different data sets to kind of see how we're doing from a vulnerability management perspective, maybe from a detailed vulnerability management perspective. If we want some asset specific information, we can kind of see all that here, as well as from a patching perspective. So if we want to see how we're doing on patching in the patching side, we can kind of pull in all that information. Again, some just different information, different tabs. And we'll go over kind of a quick little demo here of a problem that I have within my environment and just kind of show the use case of this. One other thing that I do like to show, let's see, is we also kind of track some of the historical asset information. So we're able to see, you know, the breakdown of assets, online, offline count, maybe some history on that, and how that breaks down as far as when machines are online or offline. As far as kind of where this comes in super handy. So again, tracking specific metrics and KPIs. You can see here some of my all-time metrics. We have some trend lines and some things. So we can see when we're detecting things, when we're mitigating things, and you know how we're doing overall. See, my overall performance is a little bit lower than we'd like to see. Definitely, you know, somewhere over 80, 90% is where we want to be. And the active vulnerabilities that I have within my environment. So looking at about 4,500 currently. If we scroll down, we have some time filtered, and they're filtered based on the last 30 days. So over the last 30 days, I'm doing much better. I'm mitigating, you know, most of my vulnerabilities. I only have 10 that have come in. And we can even kind of see the vulnerability burn down, which is down here a little bit further in a comparison of January here. So we had 380 come in so far this month, and we've mitigated all but 10 of those. So we have 10 still active. And some other things that we can see here as well. So it's just some like mitigation performance. What are we mitigating as a percentage wise on our vulnerabilities, or what is our churn rate? How fast are we mitigating vulnerabilities? We can see the average here is, you know, 13 days across the board, but that doesn't account for our 45%, you know, kind of success rate here. We need to get that number higher. And so where that kind of number comes in, we can see our active vulnerability breakdown here. And we have a lot of vulnerabilities that are over 90 days. And those are going to be the ones that we need to do something with. Some of the other things that we can see here are active vulnerability breakdowns that have patches. So most of the vulnerabilities that I have do not have patches available. We can do something with. Now, this will make a little bit more sense here in just a minute. But the first thing we can do is we can dive into these criticals. We can see these records. And this is just going to give us kind of a breakdown. It's, you know, a lot of information, 531 rows. But right from here, we can go in and we can kind of get an asset distribution of this. We can see, okay, so I've, you know, got some trouble assets, but in particular here, I've got one asset that's got the most criticals on it that are vulnerable. So this is going to be an asset that we want to look at. We can kind of take that a step further. We can even go in and see these records. We can see what's going on specifically on this asset. If we take maybe a distribution of the product here, we can see this specific asset has all of those within Firefox. We can even go back and we can look at the specific version of Firefox that is installed there. Whoops. So we'll dive back into these real quick. And so this is a super helpful troubleshooting tool just to kind of see where we are within the platform, see what the data is, and overall make sense of the data, because it can be quite a bit of data. Again, this is that same view just across all assets. If I go in and view these records again here, we can scroll to the right and see what version of Firefox we have. Should be somewhere over here. Not super relevant. There is a version information somewhere in this table. But you can see from the raw product entry, it is an older version of Firefox that we're picking up. Now, that can lead to a couple of different things. With this specifically, in this case, I know that this specific asset, we've upgraded Firefox, but there's a remnant left over from that version of Firefox. And so we're still picking up that within the agent, that remnant, and that's what's causing these vulnerabilities to be detected. So we would need to go in this case and just remove that remnant from the registry on that specific asset. We could do that with a script within vRx, just kind of create a quick script to do a force on install, clean up that registry, key whatever that is, and fix all of our assets in kind of one shot with that. per asset breakdown, just so we can kind of see, okay, which of our assets are the most vulnerable and where are all our vulnerabilities coming from. Well, yeah, that's pretty much it. Back to you, Ryan, unless there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. I think it's really great to see how we can, take what might look to be a really big problem and kind of break that down and understand what is the source of that, and really just helps us kind of hone in on what needs to take place in order to get us into a better situation. So yeah, thanks for that, and definitely a lot of exciting things coming with continuing to develop it. So.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, back to the presentation, and we got about 13 minutes left here. I thought we'd end a little bit early, but it looks like we might be pretty close to the time. So thanks for everyone who stuck with us throughout. But yeah, pretty much wraps it up. If there are any questions, I know there's a few in chat, and the folks have been helping with those. But if there are any, feel free to, if you've been saving them, go ahead and add those to the chat now. While we're waiting for those to come in, we'll just kind of go through a brief overview of kind of what we've covered today and some next steps. So yeah, I see Rumen got a question there. Can all this information be exported and made as a report? So yeah, the short answer is yes. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that there. So yeah, the short answer to that is yes. There are a couple different considerations: the format of the report, the would you prefer it to be an Excel sheet, a PDF? Do you, something like Jordan showed, it's a bit more advanced, which means there's a bit more of a setup involved with it, but it gives you far much more detail and more insights, and it's much more interactive. We've got another one, which is Power BI. So yeah, there's all sorts of different reports for pretty much every type of scenario there, and that's why I said that short answer is yes. Can you unlog a user from the machine? Yeah, we could use a script for that. We could query the logged in users, what is their user session, and then we could log that user off. Would be pretty straightforward. Yeah, there's definitely other ways to do that as well. It's not something I would consider directly related to this type of vulnerability management per se, but the scripting engine does give us kind of that flexibility. So yeah, another good question. .NET always appears. Yeah, it's out there. There's a lot of .NET. It's a lot of dependency for a lot of things. Pretty ingrained into Windows. So that is something that you're going to see quite a lot of, unfortunately. But there are some different protections in place that you can use to mitigate that. A lot of times there are patches for it, as we saw in this environment. Sometimes they're baked into Windows updates, so it might be a KB versus an application patch, as we might see with like a browser. Maybe there's a script here and there, but yeah, in most cases there's going to be patches for that. You might just not see it because it's a Windows KB. So that would be, if that's something you're encountering, would be my suspicion. Cool. And yeah, those are I think all the questions for now. So again, recap, the solution: consolidated vulnerability management. It all boils down to that. The problem continues to grow. Costs are projected to rise with this. Time sink is projected to rise. So it's continues to be very important on how we handle this. We have a product vision to continue to adapt to that. I wish I could share it with you today, but I anticipate being able to very soon. So you can see some of the really cool things we have planned, and we'll be doing some micro learnings, as I mentioned, and some other things there. Here are some of the features. I'll share this out. I don't think we need to cover this in too much more detail. Maybe highlight a couple things we didn't cover in the demo, like the network scanner. So this is an agent-based solution primarily, as we touched on, but you are going to have devices in your environment which can't run an agent. They're not running Windows. They're not running Mac OS. So the network scanning portion allows us to get coverage, get visibility over some of those devices. We won't have the full remediation capabilities that we have with the agent, but you will still have the visibility to to map that out and make sure it's not a complete blind spot. There's a couple different tiers of network scan that are in the platform. That's something that we'll probably cover in the advanced session as well. But just as kind of a high level, Nmap is basically the default. where it's an open source tool. We've got a custom NSE. It's going to give us, a pretty good coverage of all of those devices and some of their vulnerabilities. If you have a customer which is more in the enterprise, they're a little bit more sensitive. Maybe they are in a very strict sector, as we touched on time and time again. They might have more requirements around that, which can be a bit of a blocker. We do have options around ingesting scan types from some other tools that do give a bit more detail than Nmap is able to. It addresses some of the Nmap shortcomings. So, those are going to be your Tenable, your Nessus, your Qualys. We can bring those into the platform. The NSE is, what is it called? It's a Vicarius Vuln NSE or something like that. It's in our GitHub. It's in our knowledge base. So if someone from the moderators can maybe drop that link there. And then, we talked about the automation in great detail, the scripts, the user and team management, how we can use that in the MSP use case for multi-tenancy and several other use cases there as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So again, really, really appreciate everyone joining. We're looking at kind of really ramping up this enablement program in 2025. So this is the first of many. Thank you, Griffin, for the NSC link. But everyone who joined today and stuck with us, they're going to receive a certification. We really appreciate sharing those on LinkedIn. It's great to see everybody sharing those and making a buzz. We also would love to see any reviews on G2. I showed earlier how we stack up basically against the competition. So having more reviews there definitely helps us. So I've got a G2 link. Again, I'm going to share out the deck with all of this in a follow-up. And that's pretty much it. So thank you again. Keep an eye out for future trainings, micro-learnings, webinars. We've been doing a lot of those. And we look forward to working with you all more. So thank you.